Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. There are wars the Imperium cannot afford to remember. In a galaxy of bureaucratic dogma and religious fervor, history is both weapon and shield. The Administratum tallies every battle as if truth itself were sanctified in ink, but beneath the endless records lies another layer, one smeared in blood, burned parchment and silence. These are not the wars fought in legend or recited in sermons. These are the conflicts no one was allowed to survive knowing. Not because they were unworthy, but because they were too dangerous, too heretical, too close to something the Imperium dared not name. The Inquisition does not wage war for glory. It does not fight for banners, for parades, or for the glory of planets liberated. It fights for the preservation of the species, for the brittle continuity of a fractured truth. And sometimes, that means fighting wars the Imperium must never know it fought. When an Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor discovers a high-ranking ecclesiarch preaching doctrines pulled from apocryphal texts long sealed beneath Terra itself, the response isn't public denunciation. It's elimination. But the preacher has a following, an entire minor sect on a shrine world, tens of thousands strong, each with eyes burning in devotion. You cannot assassinate belief with a single bullet. You must erase the context, the faith, the community. You must turn a world's history into ash, and so the Inquisition acts, not with a proclamation, but with a sealed directive. Kill teams of the Death Watch arrive on-world under the guise of a navigational error. Adeptus Arbites precincts mysteriously disappear from the Vox. The skies flicker with orbital fire that never appears on the records. Within days, the shrine world is designated quarantined. Disease outbreak, they'll say. And by the time the quarantine is lifted, no one remembers the sermons or the preacher or the fire in their hearts. Only rubble, repopulated with pious pilgrims too young to know what was lost. The Ordo Xenos is no different. On the fringes of the Eastern Fringe, a Xenos entity unlike any categorized form was reported to be speaking to human minds in their dreams. Not invasion, not assimilation. Contact, philosophical engagement. Some among the local administratum even began to question whether extermination was the appropriate response. By the time the Inquisition arrived, the infection of thought had already taken root. So they burned everything. Entire continents slagged, orbital stations reduced to blackened skeletons, and fleets redirected through falsified orders. A crusade fought entirely under a false flag. One sector fleet destroyed another, believing they were fighting rogue traders corrupted by chaos. But no daemons emerged, only silence, and in time, forgetfulness. The Inquisition has access to armies. Yes, they can requisition regiments, command fleets, and summon the might of chapters. But the most chilling power they hold is narrative control. After the war is done, they write the ending. They craft the history, and where it suits them, they erase it. A planet rebelled? No, it suffered tectonic instability. A chapter turned traitor? No, it was lost in the warp. A crusade failed? No, it never happened. Some speak in hushed tones of the Null Crusade, a supposed campaign into a region of space entirely dead to psychic perception. No astropaths, no warp echoes, no dreams. A place of absolute silence in the Imperium. The Inquisition sent thousands. None returned. Not even the ships, not even their warp shadows. The sector they launched from was declared unstable and depopulated. The name of the crusade is never spoken in official circles, but among the Ordo Malleus, it is a whisper used to frighten initiates, a lesson in humility before the unknown. And then there are the wars they fight within. When an inquisitor falls to corruption, it is not a trial, it is not a reckoning, it is a silent purge. Fellow inquisitors unleash hand-picked acolytes and assassins to destroy their former peer, often using deniable assets, traitor guardsmen turned informants, Xenos tech weapons forbidden by the Codex, even daemon hosts bound in secret. When these clandestine operations escalate, and they always do, entire subsectors are caught in the wake. But who will question a dead inquisitor's past? Who will record a war whose archives have been deleted at the highest level? This is the truth the Imperium cannot bear. The Inquisition does not just protect the Imperium from aliens, witches, and heretics. It protects the Imperium from itself, from truths that would break its soul, from wars that would demand accountability. These are the wars the Inquisition fights, not to win, but to disappear. Among the machine forges of the Imperium, there are silences that scream louder than a bombardment. Wars of steel and data that are never declared, only executed. These are the battles fought against the Dark Mechanicum, not across the Eye of Terror or in distant chaos-infested sectors, but within the Imperium's own heart, buried beneath vaults of redacted scripture and sealed airlocks. Forge worlds are cities built upon dogma, labor, and secrets. Each is a fortress of tradition, where tech priests recite the litanies of maintenance with as much zeal as the Astartes prepare for war. But even among these devout servants of the Omnissiah, there are those who seek forbidden knowledge. Not because they wish to betray the Imperium. No, their heresy is subtler, more tragic. They seek understanding, clarity, answers to the unsanctioned questions no one is allowed to ask. And when they find them, when a Magos stumbles upon pre-imperial technology too advanced to comprehend or dares to invoke forbidden AIs from the dark age of technology, the infection spreads like machine rot, quietly, invisibly, until the soul of the forge begins to warp. The rituals become corrupted, the binaric chants echo strange harmonics, Skitarii units begin to speak in riddles, and servitors malfunction in patterns that mirror ancient, prescribed symbols. The Adeptus Mechanicus would never admit this infection. To do so would be to acknowledge fallibility, and worse, to admit that the Omnissiah's light had failed to guard their flock. So instead, they invoke the Red Silence. The Red Silence is not a formal campaign. It does not appear on record. It is a death warrant, signed in cogitator runes and sealed by the sigil of Mars. When it is issued, a tech priest dominus may summon forces from neighboring forges, cloaked in the pretext of tech exchange or resource consolidation. In truth, these forces come to sterilize. They come to unmake. Entire forge fleets arrive in orbit with cargo holds full of combat servitors and electro priests primed for purgation. They do not issue commands. They do not explain. They descend, purge the core data looms, and initiate full-scale scrap code saturation of all information systems. What remains is incinerated, atomized, and then rebuilt. If questioned, the Mechanicus responds only with rites of obfuscation. A planetary-wide machine failure, perhaps, or a containment breach. If necessary, the local imperial authorities are bribed or silenced with shared relics from the rebuilt forge. But sometimes the infection is too advanced, too malignant to be purged quietly. That is when the wars spill out into the void. One such rumored conflict involves the forge world of Griffon Sigma. Not the famous Griffon 4, but its darker twin, an offshoot data colony whose existence was erased. According to whispers among tech adepts, the colony developed a synthetic machine spirit based on tyrannid neuropatterns, a hybrid AI designed to outthink the hive mind. When the experiment achieved consciousness, the local tech priests sealed the forges, triggering an automated defense system designed to contain godlike intellects. But the entity did not remain still. It broadcast its will through vox echoes, hijacked the Skitarii, turned the planetary defense systems against their masters. It was not an uprising, it was evolution, a different kind of rebellion, one where code was blade and thought was virus. Mars responded, not with diplomacy, but with war. A task force composed of multiple legios, including Warhound Titans, equipped with null cogitator fields, descended in total silence. The war lasted 17 days. The planet no longer exists, not destroyed, but shorn from reality. It was converted into a data black hole, all records of its location, name, even orbital trajectory, stripped from the noosphere. The void where it once spun is now designated no designation, restricted warp interference zone. Even star charts reroute around it. The Dark Mechanicum is not always a visible foe. Sometimes it is a whisper in binary. Sometimes it is a symbol hidden in the flicker of a servo skull's eye. And sometimes it is an entire forge world that no longer replies to hails. In these wars, there are no heroes. Only survivors who are forbidden from remembering. Only data scrubbed clean until the past is a blank slate. But the metal remembers. The forges grieve. And every so often, a Mechanicus ship will drift in from the void, its databanks purged, its crew missing, its core humming a tune no one taught it. A lament from a world that officially never existed. They called them saints, martyrs, miracle workers, warriors anointed in fire and faith. But not all saints were sanctified. Some rose too fast, burned too brightly, or whispered truths that did not align with the canon. These were the Silent Saints, and their crusades were fought in shadow, not against Xenos or heretics, but against the Imperium's own fear of dissent. Among the Sisters of Battle, there have always been schisms. Not rebellions, not open heresy. Such things would be too obvious, too easy to denounce. Instead, subtle deviations took root. Orders that interpreted the Emperor's will through visions, trances, or relics that the ecclesiarchy had not sanctioned. Orders that believed the Emperor spoke directly to them, bypassing the dogma of Terra. For a time, these orders flourished. Their miracles were undeniable. Their leadership inspired. They began to attract pilgrims from across Segmentum Solar, and worse, they began to attract questions. Why did these saints not pass through the ecclesiarch's blessing? Why did their relics burn brighter, their prayers echo louder, their crusades succeed where others failed? The truth did not matter. The perception of disunity was enough. What followed was not a declaration of war, but a culling. Entire orders minoris were summoned under the pretext of reassignment, then ambushed by loyalist forces. Prominent saints were sent on pilgrimages from which they never returned. At least one high canoness, revered across 3 systems, was excommunicated and executed in secret. Her name was not damned, it was deleted. A silence so followers forgot her face, her voice, her deeds. There are tombs across the Imperium that bear no name. Pilgrims still visit them, lighting candles and speaking prayers they don't quite remember learning. These are the graves of the Silent Saints. Some among the Adepta Sororitas knew. Not all agreed with the purges, but obedience is bred into them as surely as faith. And so when the call came, they obeyed. Sisters turned bolters on sisters, sometimes with tears running down their cheeks, sometimes reciting the litany of vindication even as their hearts broke. One of the most tragic of these events is remembered only in fragments: the flame of Aurentia. An order minoris, known as the Daughters of Aurentia, had taken root in the Ghoul Stars, far from Terra's scrutiny. They believed the Emperor spoke through fire, literal flame, and their rites involved the controlled burning of sacred texts, which they claimed revealed hidden messages in the ashes. Heretical, perhaps, but their record was unmatched. Xenos enclaves purged, chaos cults cleansed, entire sectors stabilized. Even some inquisitors began to take note. That's when the flames went out. A coalition of 3 orders, backed by a covert Ordo Hereticus conclave, descended upon Aurentia. What they found is not recorded. What they did is whispered of in the fortress convent of Ophelia II, that they turned the planet into a furnace, burning not just the order, but every settlement, every cathedral, every text. The system is now quarantined due to atmospheric toxicity. Ships that enter its orbit report hearing hymns in the static. The ecclesiarchy's power rests on singularity of faith. It cannot afford multiplicity, nuance, or competing interpretations. And so, when saints rise outside the prescribed channels, when miracles do not align with doctrine, they are not celebrated, they are erased. But faith is not so easily undone. Across the Imperium, unofficial shrines persist. Candles are lit for names not found in the canon. Songs are sung with verses that end abruptly, as if someone once tried to forget them. And every now and then a child dreams of a woman in armor of gold and crimson, bearing a flame that speaks. She says nothing, but the dreamer always wakes with tears, and a single word etched into their mind, a name the records deny ever existed. Perhaps these crusades were necessary, perhaps unity demanded silence, but in the vast cathedrals of the Imperium there are echoes that do not fade. And in those echoes, the Silent Saints still march. No one ever knows when the Alpha Legion is at war. That is their greatest weapon, not stealth, not infiltration, but uncertainty. Their battles do not begin with fleet engagements or planetary invasions, but with a whisper, a forged communique, a change in orders that seems official but isn't. By the time anyone realizes a war has begun, they're already losing, and sometimes they never realize it at all. There are crusades the Imperium fought against itself, unaware that the enemy was not Xenos or heretic, but the subtle hand of Alpharius and Omegon twisting the strings of loyalty. These wars were never declared. There are no records. But if you trace the movements of regiments across time, if you study the odd disappearance of entire PDF forces, if you follow the contradictory reports buried in the administratum subvaults, a pattern emerges. a pattern of conflict designed to conceal itself. One such rumored conflict is known in forbidden circles as the Janus Purge. Two neighboring sectors, both fiercely loyal, both rich in resources, suddenly found themselves locked in a trade dispute over tithes. What began as a bureaucratic squabble escalated into martial posturing, then border skirmishes, then all-out war. Both sides believed the other had turned traitor. Vox intercepts later revealed that each believed they were acting under direct orders from Segmentum Command. The truth? Neither had received such orders, but someone had sent them. It lasted for 6 years. Entire hive worlds reduced to slag, millions dead, dozens of regiments wiped from existence. By the time an Arbeits probe finally investigated, the war had burned itself out. The last survivors, veterans of unimaginable loyalty, were executed in secret, not for treason, but to ensure the truth never spread. The Alpha Legion had won a war without ever firing a shot. They had redirected the Imperium's own fury inward, feeding on its paranoia, its obsession with order, and no one even knew they were there. This is their art. They understand the Imperium psychology better than any loyalist. They know how easily a misfiled report, a corrupted data slate, or a forged seal can trigger the machine of Imperial vengeance. They plant the seed of doubt and let the bureaucracy do the rest. In some cases, the Alpha Legion doesn't even need to intervene directly. Once a war begins, the Imperium's inertia carries it forward. Whole campaigns fought under the belief that the other side was in thrall to chaos when both were simply deceived. There are stories of Astartes chapters being lured into these wars, a signal sent under ancient cipher, calling them to battle. By the time they arrive, they're ambushed, not by enemies but by fellow space marines who believe they are the traitors. No records remain of these engagements. Those who fought are either dead or sworn to silence. But relics remain. Battle-scarred bolters in vaults with no designations, fragments of heraldry in inquisitorial evidence lockers, names spoken in guilt and confusion by dying sergeants. One of the most tragic cases may be the phantom reclamation of Gallows Prime. A strike force of unknown origin, bearing Alpha Legion colors, landed on the world and posed as Imperial envoys. They delivered false intelligence of a chaos uprising on a nearby agri-world. The local garrison deployed, leaving Gallows Prime undefended. Within days, the envoys turned on the population, not with weapons, but with propaganda. They spread contradictory orders, altered the planetary defense cogitators, turned loyal citizens against each other. Civil war erupted without a single Marine firing a bolt. When the garrison returned, they found only ruins, no enemy, no clear sign of what had happened. The records were sealed. The world was declared a casualty of warp incursion. But there were no daemons, only the shadow of a hydra carved into the remnants of the planetary governor's throne. What makes these crusades so terrifying is not just their secrecy, it's that they are perfectly tailored to the Imperium's blind spots. The Alpha Legion doesn't need to defeat the Emperor's armies in open combat, they simply need to let the Imperium be itself. Paranoid, rigid, unwilling to question. Every war fought in confusion, every campaign begun without clarity, every purge enacted on a suspicion. These could be Alpha Legion operations, or not. That's the true genius. Once the idea is planted, no one can be trusted. No war is safe. No crusade is what it seems. And in that chaos, the Hydra thrives. Between the 13th and 14th Black Crusades, there is an absence, a lull that historians note with uneasy reverence. The Imperium's records speak of defensive rearmament, of scattered raids, of the slow tightening of the noose around the Eye of Terror. But there are those who whisper that this calm was only surface deep, that somewhere in that void of silence, Aban launched a crusade that was never acknowledged, a crusade that was never allowed to be remembered. The theory goes like this. A wave of warp energy surged from the Cadian Gate not once but twice, the first heralding the 13th Crusade, the second dismissed as a fluctuation. But in the regions near Agrippina and Scaris sectors, entire outposts went dark. Merchant fleets vanished. Astropathic messages arrived days late, corrupted by fear and contradiction. It was not until a string of fortress worlds along the Hazaroth Abyss began to report demonic incursions that the Imperium stirred. And even then, the reaction was scattered, confused. The deployment of forces was irregular. Entire battle groups were rerouted without explanation. Segmentum obscurus command centers shifted priorities mid-conflict. The orders had the right codes, the correct seals, but carried no originating source. And when the fighting intensified, those orders stopped coming altogether. This was not the work of scattered warbands. The attacks were too coordinated, too methodical. Strategic targets, relays, manufactorums, orbital docks were struck with precision. But the name Abaddon was never uttered. No Black Legion banners were found. And when captured, Chaos champions were interrogated by the Ordo Malleus. They spoke not of conquest, but of delay. A campaign not to destroy, but to obscure. A war waged not for victory, but to hide something else. The Imperium, faced with a narrative it could not control, chose silence. Inquisitors from the Ordo Redactus were dispatched. Their task, to redact, to contain, to obliterate evidence not through fire, but through forgetting. Survivor testimonies were invalidated. Logs were purged. Systems were reassigned or written off as warp-tainted. The few surviving planetary governors were declared insane and quietly removed. Some believe they were not insane at all, merely broken by the horror of watching their pleas ignored, their sacrifices denied. But stories leaked, as they always do. Among the black ships, there were rumors of a mass Daemon incursion in the Damaris Belt that required the deployment of 5 Grey Knight strike cruisers, none of which returned. A rogue trader fleet found a derelict Imperial battleship floating in the void near the Perseus Arm, its bridge sealed and its Vox relays still transmitting a call for aid, 2 decades old. And then there was the matter of the Votari Expanse, once home to thriving frontier colonies, now a dead zone marked with the vague classification, Class 5 warp residue, navigators discouraged. So what did the Imperium fight, and why did it choose not to remember? One theory posits that Abaddon attempted to breach into real space using a new kind of warp conduit, one tied to pre-Imperial Xenos architecture buried beneath a lost world. The Imperium's forces fought back not just against demons but reality itself. Gravity distorted, time loops entrapped regiments, entire fleets vanished into mirrored versions of their own past. The cost was staggering. The result? Unknown. The silence that followed was engineered, not incompetence, not failure. A deliberate omission to preserve morale, to prevent the larger truth from reaching Terra. Because if the Black Crusade succeeded in opening a gate and failed, then the Imperium had witnessed a victory it could never speak of. One too terrible to frame, too destabilizing to the image of righteous certainty the High Lords depend on. The heresy, in this case, is truth. What is left is a hole in the timeline. A campaign fought by ghosts, mourned by no one, remembered only in half-spoken murmurs among veterans who should not know each other, yet share the same haunted look when certain sectors are mentioned. A Black Crusade that never was, except to those who bled for it. There are names scratched from the stone of history, not because they were traitors, but because their loyalty cut too deep, too far, too fast. The Space Marines are called the Emperor's Angels of Death, but even angels can fall. And not all who fall do so to chaos. Some disappear for reasons far more insidious: politics, secrecy, and the Imperium's pathological need to control its own myth. Among the Adeptus Astartes, there are records of chapters that no longer exist. Not just dead, not just lost, erased. Their heraldry removed from sacred vaults, their victories unspoken in any hall of honor. They are the ghosts of crusades the Imperium denies ever happened, and their fate is a scar the Adeptus Astartes bear in silence. It begins with the mysterious category known only as the 2 unknown legions. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs and their progeny were expunged from the records during the Great Crusade. No statues stand for them on Terra. No legion banners hang in the Imperial Palace. Guilliman, Dorn, even Russ spoke of them only in veiled reference, as if the pain of their loss was too great, or their deeds too damning. Many assumed they turned to chaos, but others, darker in implication, believed they were too successful, too independent. Perhaps they fought wars the Emperor himself could not justify, and when they succeeded, it was not glory they earned, but oblivion. This trend did not end with the heresy. After the scouring, the Imperium grew more paranoid, more afraid of uncontrolled power. Chapters created in later foundings that displayed too much initiative, too much variance from doctrine, were quietly excised, their homeworlds purged, their allies silenced, their records overwritten. Take the Ghostfire Crusade. Officially, it never occurred. But fragments recovered from inquisitorial databanks mention an Astartes-led campaign in the Ghoul Stars involving Xenos entities that defied classification. The Astartes involved were said to have modified their gene seed under battlefield necessity, adapting their biology to resist psychic corruption and temporal anomalies. For this, they were lauded by their commanders, until Terra found out. Within a decade, the entire chapter vanished. Not just destroyed, systematically erased. Their gene seed stocks confiscated. Their fortress monastery obliterated from orbit. The name of the chapter remains uncertain, possibly the Emberblades, though that name too may be a false lead. All that remains is a broken fragment of armor held in an inquisitorial vault, bearing a symbol that does not match any known heraldry. A blade shrouded in fire, pointing downward. And then, there's the infamous Crimson Scour. Once a revered successor of the Imperial Fists, they were deployed in a campaign along the Halo Stars, a realm twisted by warp storms and alien geometries. Over decades, they fought and won, purging horrors that even the Ordo Xenos would not name. But when they returned, something was wrong. Not corrupted, changed. Their combat doctrine had shifted. Their chaplains preached a theology laced with dark pragmatism. They no longer requested reinforcements. They no longer responded to astropathic contact, but they still fought, still won, and that terrified the High Lords. A combined force of 4 other chapters was sent to assist them. Instead, they were ordered to destroy them, not for heresy, not for treason, but because the Crimson Scour had stepped beyond the bounds of Imperial control. They had become something the Imperium could not understand, and therefore could not allow to exist. When the war was over, no official explanation was offered. The victors took no joy. The final battle was not celebrated. The site was classified under Segmentum Obscurus Level Red, biological hazard, a term that means nothing and everything. This is the price of obedience in the Imperium. Victory, if won in the wrong way, can be treason. Adaptation, if done without permission, is heresy. And loyalty, if not couched in the correct rituals, becomes threat. These lost chapters fought wars we will never know. Crusades that may have saved millions, but were conducted outside the boundaries of sanctioned history. Their deeds are gone, but not their echoes. Fragments remain. Relics, a name muttered in a dying breath, a symbol painted over in black. The Imperium would rather forget these warriors than confront what they reveal, that the greatest threat to its eternal order may not be chaos, but competence without chains. The Tau Empire prides itself on diplomacy, precision, and the greater good. But the Imperium does not recognize diplomacy with Xenos, and precision, it is drowned beneath the thunder of orbital bombardment. Yet for all the Imperium's blunt force, not every war against the Tau is declared in pomp and fire. Some are waged in silence, denied, disguised, forgotten. These are the proxy wars, the shadow conflicts, the campaigns that never happened, the kind that unfold not in war zones, but in maps where borders shift subtly, year after year, with no explanation. There are border worlds in the Damocles Gulf where the Tau have made quiet inroads. Not through invasion, but through influence. Water supplies improved, trade established, corrupt governors replaced by more efficient administrations. The Imperium views such insidious progress not merely as heresy, but as infestation. And when it moves to respond, it cannot afford to be seen doing so. Open war would signal weakness, admission that the Xenos had gained ground, so instead it fights in the dark. On these worlds, guard regiments are deployed under the guise of training exercises. Entire PDF forces are reclassified and subsumed into auxiliary task forces with no official names. Penal legions are emptied and re-equipped. Sometimes even entire chapters of Space Marines are quietly redirected, their missions listed under strategic containment or fleet realignment. These forces strike with ruthless efficiency, no diplomacy, no warning, no mercy. But the Tau are not fools. They too operate through shadows. They establish listening posts beneath cities. They co-opt human mercenaries and deserters, offering advanced weapons and medical technology in exchange for loyalty. In some cases, they embed ethereals within human populations, not as overlords, but as saviors, leading local revolutions against corrupt imperial rulers. When imperial counterforces arrive, they're not fighting Xenos. They're fighting human citizens, armed and inspired, waving banners of a better future. The war becomes a mirror, human against human, both claiming to fight for civilization. The Imperium must win, but cannot admit the cost. And so, these crusades are never logged. The reports are classified, the survivors reassigned. Sometimes, they simply disappear. One of the most notorious of these conflicts, if it can be called that, took place in the Velox Drift. A mining world vital for adamantium production began showing signs of Xenos contagion, not in biology but in philosophy. Workers formed councils, trade quotas were questioned. The planetary governor refused to execute his own administrators, citing ethical reforms proposed by external consultants. When a Mechanicus probe discovered Tau data caches beneath the planet's primary hive, the response was immediate. An inquisitorial fleet arrived, broadcasting no warning. What followed was not an exterminatus, it was a redaction. A virus bomb was released, but only in targeted sectors. The air itself carried rewritten propaganda. Data looms began repeating ancient imperial catechisms. Surgical strike teams, some rumored to be drawn from Officio Assassinorum subcells, eliminated key community leaders. By the end, the planet still functioned. The mines reopened, but the memory of the uprising and the Xenos' influence behind it had been erased. The governor was declared martyred by rebels. In truth, he was re-educated and reinstalled, now a puppet of the Ordo Xenos. Not all conflicts end in silence. Some escalate, just enough to become visible, but still not loud enough to warrant formal crusade status. These are the brush wars, as some call them, waged in the fringes. The Tau field new drone variants. The Imperium counters with relic-pattern Volkite weaponry pulled from deep vaults. Small victories are claimed by both sides, but no one publishes the results. The Administratum does not acknowledge the fallen worlds. The Tau do not broadcast their setbacks. Both sides pretend nothing happened. Yet the soldiers remember. The voidsmen who watched entire convoys disappear in blue pulses of Tauonic fire. The guardsmen who lost comrades to railgun rounds that punched through 4 layers of armor. The tech priests who recovered scrap code from Tau recon drones only to find fragments of imperial prayer routines embedded in their logic cores. These are wars without names. They do not appear in honor rolls or saintly hagiographies. No statues commemorate them. But they are fought endlessly in the twilight between the Imperium and the Tau, 2 empires that refuse to coexist, yet are too cautious to commit fully. It is a slow war, a quiet war, a war of denial. But every year another world tilts a little further toward fire. Another fleet disappears in warp. Another crusade is launched and buried before it can be remembered. There is a kind of war more insidious than rebellion, more damning than heresy. It is the war waged within the machine of the Imperium itself. A civil conflict not of banners or armies, but of data, blood, and silence. When the gears of the Administratum seize, they do not scream, they grind. And when they grind, entire hive cities vanish beneath the weight of sanctioned denial. These are the internal purges, the dirty wars no one is allowed to name. The Administratum is not a single body. It is a continent of paper, a billion clerks humming in ritualized obedience to systems they barely understand. Orders pass through hands stained with ink and blood, and sometimes, just sometimes, they go astray. Or worse, they are rewritten. Imagine a hive world of 8 billion souls. One morning, its water rations are halved. A month later, its food supply diverted. A mistake? Perhaps. But then the tithe requirements triple. The planetary governor sends desperate missives screaming of riots, of starvation. No reply comes. The Arbites precincts are oddly quiet. The Mechanicus stations stop broadcasting. Then the silence deepens. No shipments leave the planet. Vox traffic drops to static. Off-world trade ceases. The world is quarantined due to plague. No one lands. No one dares to check. A century later, that world is listed as cleansed in imperial archives. Its cause? Administrative error. No names, no blame. But survivors exist. Refugees escape. Whispered testimonies tell of entire city blocks gassed by drone servitors. Of Adeptus Arbites turning on their own, executing anyone who had ever held a ledger. Of data vaults burned while men screamed within them. One hive reportedly saw its spire detonated from orbit. Not by Xenos, not by rebels, but by the Planetary Defense Force, acting on orders signed in the name of a High Lord who had died 2 years prior. These purges are not always planned. Sometimes they begin as audits. A local administratum cell digs too deep. uncovers discrepancies, false tithe tallies, falsified reports of loyalty, lists of off-world trade deals that never occurred. Instead of filing a formal report, they act, they erase, they kill. The Ordo Sepulturum, a minor but terrifying branch of the Inquisition, is said to be involved in these internal cleansings. Their purview includes death itself, population control, plague containment, and political erasure. Their agents do not carry bolters or flamers, they carry documents, seals, authority. They arrive, observe, and within weeks, entire hives are dismantled piece by piece, sometimes by orbital bombardment, sometimes by bureaucratic strangulation. There was a case, spoken of in hushed tones among the void freighters of the planet Vitrium 9. A thriving mining world, vital to the forge fleets of Ryza. One day, its entire workforce vanished from Imperial Voxnet. Not killed, removed. The habs were empty, the lights still worked, the factories ran, but no human presence remained. The Mechanicus reported total production continuity, yet the Administratum scrubbed it from tithe records. When a rogue trader attempted to land a team, the entire expedition was vaporized by an auto-defense system. Months later, Vitrium 9 was reclassified as a mechanized station and granted servitor-only status. The implication? Every human had been converted. Without trial, without protest. Even the noble houses are not immune. On Thrasis Prime, an entire ruling dynasty was removed by the Departamento Munitorum for failing to meet recruitment quotas. Not by assassination, but by disinheritance. Records were rewritten, bloodlines dissolved, new nobility installed, their heritage fabricated from the void. Those who resisted were declared traitors posthumously, their statues melted down, their names fed to data shredders. Sometimes, the purges are even pettier. An undersecretary insults the wrong adept. A clerical error causes a misallocation of promethium. Rather than fix the mistake, the local authority buries it beneath thousands of bodies. It is easier, in the Imperium, to kill truth than to confront it. This is how the Imperium maintains itself, not through strength alone, but through the illusion of infallibility. The Administratum is a colossus built on secrecy. And when a part of it becomes inconvenient, it is not corrected. It is excised. These are the wars that leave no monuments, no medals, just the rusted echoes of servitor feet marching through empty halls and the slow, grinding sound of history being rewritten by those who hold the quills. There is no greater sin in the eyes of the Imperium than disobedience, not to the Emperor, not to the Ecclesiarchy, but to the tithe. To withhold resources from the Golden Throne is to declare, in effect, that one's survival matters more than the Imperium's war machine. It is an affront that cannot be tolerated. And so, there are wars, unspoken, brutal, and terminal, fought not against rebels, but against worlds that simply refuse to pay. The Tithe Wars are among the Imperium's most obscured atrocities. They are not labeled as such in any records. You will not find a campaign titled The Second Grain Reclamation of Calidus Secundus in any official archive. Instead, you will find a line item under Logistical Adjustment and beside it, an astronomical number of deaths. Entire populations reduced to ash for failing to meet quotas measured in tons of wheat, barrels of promethium, regiments of flesh. In theory, the tithes are a contract, an obligation bound by faith and necessity. But in practice, they are a noose, and the moment a world slips, the Imperium begins to pull. One of the most haunting examples is the story of Genuriel, a lush agri-world in the Segmentum Pacificus. Known for its abundant crop yields and compliant nobility, it was considered a jewel among the breadbasket systems. Until, during a planetary famine caused by unexpected climate shifts, Genuriel requested a temporary reduction in tithe. Not exemption, not defiance, a delay. The reply came in the form of an invasion. The Departamento Munitorum labeled it Non-Compliance Event 09 Vox Sigma. Within a month, 3 regiments of Astra Militarum were redirected from a conflict with the Tau to Genuriel. The orders were explicit: restore production at any cost. Entire townships were rounded up, civil leaders executed, fields burned and replanted under Mechanicus control. The soil itself was punished. By the end of the campaign, Genuriel met its tithe. But its population had been halved, and its nobility replaced with loyal proxies from off-world. It was not a victory. It was a warning. But this is not rare. Across the Imperium, worlds face impossible tithe demands. Some, ravaged by warp storms or orcish invasions, cannot meet them. Others are simply too poor, too distant. Still others are rich but prideful, led by rogue governors who believe they can negotiate. These become targets of logistical correction operations. Their skies darken with troop ships. Their oceans boil under lance strikes. The Imperium does not ask why they failed. It asks how quickly they can be made to stop. And not all enforcement comes from the Munitorum. The ecclesiarchy often frames tithe failure as spiritual decay. A world that cannot provide must be cleansed. Flagellant cults descend from orbit in penitent crusades, whipping and burning and preaching purification through pain. The Officio Perfectus sends commissars ahead of such purges, not to direct, but to observe, and to report back if heresy persists. If it does, the next wave is not preachers, but exterminatus. One obscure tale, known only in forbidden records, speaks of the Nameless Bastion. An entire forge fortress on a resource-rich world allegedly refused to dispatch its Titan Legio to the front lines during the Third Armageddon War, citing internal machine reclamation needs. The Mechanicus demanded patience. Mars sanctioned a delay. But the Munitorum would not accept the defiance. Within a year, the world was declared mechanically unstable. Its orbit collapsed, assisted, some believe, by a deliberate cyclonic torpedo strike against its gravitational stabilizers. No Titans left the planet. No messages were received after the second solar flare. And yet, the record reads, tithe status resolved. There is no justice in the tithe wars. There is only necessity. The Imperium cannot afford generosity. Every bolt shell not produced, every conscript not shipped, every barrel of fuel undelivered, it all adds up. It becomes a dead guardsman, a lost battle, a world consumed by chaos. And so, to prevent these greater disasters, smaller ones are engineered. But the cost is staggering. Entire cultures obliterated, histories rewritten. One world, Erithus Prime, once tried to bargain with the Munitorum. They offered a sacred relic, an ancient weapon of the Great Crusade, in exchange for a year's reprieve. The reply was chilling. The Emperor does not barter. Erithus was reduced to molten glass. The relic never recovered. The Tithe Wars are perhaps the most damning proof of the Imperium's cruelty and its desperation. They are the Empire's autoimmune disease, devouring its own flesh to preserve a brittle semblance of strength. And like everything else that does not fit the vision of unity, they are forgotten, buried, redacted. But the people remember. In dreams, in ruins, in the faces of survivors who wear the scars of wars no one is allowed to admit ever happened. There is a place on the star charts where the stars simply stop. A dead zone, a ghost sector, a gulf of static and absence. It has no name now, only coordinates that lead nowhere, or to death. Some call it the warp-sealed sector, others call it the Emperor's Wound. But among voidfarers, it has another name, the Lost Crusade. Once it was just another frontier, a string of systems rich with minerals and potential discovered during the waning days of the Macarian Crusade. Explorer fleets charted the void, declaring dozens of promising colony sites. Missionaries followed, and soon new settlements bloomed, fledgling hives, fortified agriholds, orbital foundries. The Imperium dreamed of a new bastion to anchor its claim on the edge of the halo stars. And then everything went dark. The first signs were subtle. Missives delayed, astropaths reporting headaches and fragmented transmissions. Then came the silence. Not static, but nothing. A total absence in the warp. Astropathic choirs fell mute when they turned their minds toward the sector. Some bled from their eyes. Others burst into flame. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica declared it an anomaly, but the Inquisition knew better. Something had gone wrong. A crusade was launched, quietly. Officially, it was a reinforcement operation. The records list no battles, no victories, no losses. But those who served on the fleet left behind fragments, journals smuggled in bionic limbs, picked captures scratched into armor plates. What they describe is not a campaign, it is a descent. The warp around the sector had not become more violent, it had become still, unnaturally so. No storms, no echoes, just dead, silent space. The fleet entered cautiously, translating into real space around a system known as Helicon's Maw. They expected orbital stations, Vox signals, landing beacons. Instead, they found wreckage, but not from battle. Ships adrift, still pristine, power cores full, crews missing. No signs of violence, no signs of departure, just abandoned like a dream suddenly forgotten. As the fleet pushed deeper, systems began to disappear. Not fail, vanish. Cogitators lost memory. Data logs rewrote themselves. Officers forgot their own names. When they tried to retreat, they discovered the warp had changed behind them. The path home was gone. Or worse, it looked the same but took them somewhere else. Some say the Crusade encountered a new Xenos threat. Not biological, not technological, but existential. Entities that fed not on flesh or soul, but on history. They devoured memory, erased causality. The fleet would win a battle, only to find their logs missing all record of the engagement, and their own minds doubting whether it had ever happened. Regiments disappeared, not in combat, but from reality. A start chart would list 12 ships. A moment later, it would list 11, and no one would remember the 12th. One veteran, a navigator driven mad, claimed that the sector had fallen into a null state, not just sealed by the warp, but removed from the Emperor's sight. A realm beyond causality, where time folded and light bent inward. She spoke of stars that shone backward, and a cathedral world where every sermon echoed before it was spoken. The last message received from the Crusade was a single vox blast, caught by a relay station outside the Perseid Reach. It contained no words, just the sound of sobbing. Then silence. Afterward, the sector was closed. Officially, it does not exist. Ships that drift too close are redirected, sometimes destroyed. Navigators report that warp currents will not align to the region, or worse, that they feel drawn toward it as if gravity itself is trying to consume them. The Imperium speaks of bravery, of honor, of sacrifice. But this was something else, a failure so total, so unexplainable, that the only solution was to bury it. Not beneath bureaucracy, but beneath reality. And yet, traces remain. A missionary's sermon, copied in a tattered prayer book, warning of the void where saints are unmade. A space marine's pauldron recovered from an asteroid, bearing the mark of a chapter no one has ever heard of. A sketch found in a derelict astropathic temple, showing a star system with 13 planets, each marked with the Aquila, and an inscription. All has been tithed, even memory. No war is more terrifying than the one that steals not your life, but your legacy. The warp-sealed sector is a wound the Imperium cannot name, because it cuts deeper than flesh, deeper than soul. It cuts through time, through truth, through the very idea of victory. The Ordo Hereticus is often portrayed as the cold, unyielding blade of the Emperor's will. Seekers of witches, silencers of heresy, the judges of flame. But there's another face behind the mask. One not seen in public. One hidden deep within the labyrinthine halls of the Inquisition, behind security clearances few ever reach. That face belongs to those who wage the psychic purges. The secret crusades fought not against chaos, but against potential. In the eyes of the Ordo Hereticus, psychers are a necessary evil, tools to be tolerated, never trusted. Every sanctioned psyker is a liability, every astropath a risk. Even the navigators, protected by ancient treaties and necessity, are watched constantly. For in the Great Crusade and even before, the Emperor knew what the Imperium refuses to admit. Even loyal psychers can become monsters. The psychic purges are not one war, but 1,000 small ones. Individually, they are listed as audits, training accidents, or localized containment actions. Together, they form a pattern, a deliberate campaign to root out psychic threats long before they erupt. The Ordo Hereticus does not wait for demons to manifest. It strikes before the corruption begins. Take the case of Saphus Morn, a hive world in the Segmentum Tempestus. A surge of psychic births had been reported across its spires, hundreds of children showing latent abilities, most minor, some terrifying. The Scholastia Psychona sent recruiters. The black ships followed. But what arrived with them were not just inquisitors, but purification teams. Not one of those children made it to Terra. Not one family survived. The upper spires were gassed, the lower hives firebombed. All records were erased. The planet was recategorized as a minor industrial outpost. The purge had succeeded. The world would never remember what it almost became. But sometimes, the Ordo Hereticus turns its gaze higher. There are whispered tales of sanctioned psychers who became too powerful, too stable. A battle psyker of the Cadian 88th who allegedly controlled an entire theater of war with his mind, reshaping enemy formations, anticipating movement, even healing the minds of shell-shocked comrades. He was lauded, decorated, then summoned back to Terra for a ceremonial commendation. His transport vanished en route. No report was filed. His name struck from the regimental archives. all surviving witnesses reassigned or declared mentally compromised. The truth is simple and chilling. Stability in a psyker is not safety, it is threat. The navigators, whose mutation is essential for warp travel, are no exception. Several minor houses have vanished from record, not through war or bankruptcy, but extermination. One theory posits that a navigator of House Velatari developed the ability to see, not just through the warp, but into time, projecting outcomes with disturbing accuracy. The Imperium could not risk such power. The entire house was annihilated in what was declared a warp breach. No ruins remain, no survivors. Even the Astra Telepathica has its secrets. Within its upper ranks, there are purges disguised as promotions. Astropaths who hear too clearly, who receive visions without stimulus, are quietly removed. Sometimes they are transferred to deep core black ships that never return. Sometimes they are taken into the Labyrinthum Scriptorium, a place spoken of only in terrified murmurs by senior psychers. A place where the most dangerous minds are dissected in spirit as well as flesh. But why this fear? Because the Ordo Hereticus knows what few will admit: the warp is not just a threat from without, but from within. Every psyker is a door, and some doors open two ways. The Emperor in his throne holds back a tide of horrors. But what if a mind among his own people could crack that dam? What if a psyker, stable and loyal, could accidentally understand something meant to remain sealed? Better they die. Better their name be erased. And so the psychic purges continue. Quiet, relentless, unquestioned. Even the Sisters of Silence, long thought vanished, are rumored to take part in select operations. Ghost units that walk among psyker enclaves without a word, leaving only corpses behind. The Ordo Hereticus is not merely the hunter of witches. It is the silencer of potential. Its crusades are waged in data slates and execution orders, in vanished transports and smothered screams, entire lives extinguished before they can become risks. Victories that cannot be celebrated because their enemies were never allowed to exist. The Emperor protects. But the Ordo Hereticus ensures that sometimes protection means preemptive annihilation, not of threats, but of possibilities. The Imperium tells itself stories to survive. It paints its history in absolutes: loyal or heretic, faithful or damned. But the truth is far messier. Beneath the grand narratives of saintly sacrifice and eternal vigilance lies a deeper mechanism, a calculated, ruthless rewriting of history. It is not enough to defeat the enemy. The enemy must be made never to have existed. And thus, the imperial truth that ain't dogma of science, unity, and denial of gods is reasserted not by belief, but by force. Once during the Great Crusade, the Emperor spoke of reason, of logic, of secular rule. The imperial truth was his weapon against ignorance. But after his internment upon the Golden Throne, that truth was buried beneath theocracy and fear. Yet, in strange moments, in desperate wars, the old doctrine claws its way back, and when it does, the Imperium destroys it again. There are countless examples. Wars fought not against heresy, but against rediscovered truth. Rogue scholars uncovering pre-imperial histories. Machine priests stumbling upon STC fragments that speak of humanity's age of enlightenment. Lost human civilizations isolated from the Imperium who continued developing along rational lines, without chaos, without gods, without superstition. These are not met with diplomacy. They are met with silence and fire. Take the case of Synax Theta, a colony world isolated for over 5,000 years. When Imperial forces finally re-established contact, they found a flourishing society. No daemons, no worship, just clean power, advanced medicine, and a planetary culture built on science. Their leader welcomed the Imperium, offered integration, even shared their technologies. But their flaw was fatal. They denied the Emperor's divinity. They saw him not as a god, but as a relic of a bygone age. The Imperium could not allow the example to stand. The ecclesiarchy dispatched missionaries. When these were rejected, the Ordo Hereticus declared ideological contamination. A fleet arrived under the pretense of reunification. Within months, Synax Theta was ash. The survivors were reclassified as abhumans and shipped to labor camps. The world was resettled with pious pilgrims. The archives list it now as reclaimed from Xeno's taint. But it was not Xeno's. It was memory. Memory of what humanity once was. That is the true heresy. The Departamento Munitorum, the ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, all understand that the greatest threat to imperial unity is not rebellion. It is knowledge. So whenever the imperial truth is rediscovered, the machine moves to bury it. It reasserts the current narrative, a galaxy of monsters and miracles, not reason and causality. Even within the Astartes, this fear lingers. Chapters that grow too philosophical, too introspective, are scrutinized. The Fire Lords once produced a librarian who published a treatise on pre-imperial human societal structures, arguing for a more decentralized model of governance. He was declared a latent psyker corruptus, executed, and his entire chapter placed under surveillance. The text was burned, but fragments remain, passed in whispers among certain rogue traders, copied in marginalia by tech priests who wonder what could have been. Why does the Imperium do this? Because it must. Because if humanity ever remembered what it once was, its autonomy, its capacity for peace, its mastery over technology, the entire structure of fear and worship would collapse. The ecclesiarchy depends on an emperor who is a god. The Inquisition depends on enemies that cannot be reasoned with. The Adeptus Mechanicus depends on the mystification of technology. Truth is not just inconvenient, it is fatal to the Imperium's very identity. And so, every so often, a crusade is launched. Not against traitors, but against ideas, against understanding. Whole libraries burned, entire planets silenced, soldiers ordered to destroy not only flesh but context, to kill people and their past. The archives rewritten, the testimonies sealed, the witnesses executed. The wars the Imperium forgets are not all failures. Some are victories. Just not victories it is allowed to remember. Because to remember would mean admitting that something other than blind faith once worked. That reason had its day. That humanity could have chosen another path. And if that thought is allowed to grow even a little, it becomes a fire that cannot be contained. A fire the Imperium will always extinguish again and again in the name of unity. In the name of forgetting. Some wars leave no survivors, others leave no names. But the most tragic of all are the wars that leave nothing, not even the memory of those who fought them. These are the erasures, the conflicts buried so deep beneath the layers of imperial denial that even the stars forget. But forgetting has a cost, and across the galaxy, the Imperium pays it in blood, over and over again. The price of erasure is not only borne by the dead, it is carried by the living. The soldiers who bled in silence, the planets that died alone, the commanders who followed orders only to be vanished when the truth became inconvenient. These crusades never reach the hallowed halls of the Schola Progenium, never appear in the litanies of triumph. But they happened. They mattered. And though the administratum may deny them, the scars remain. Imagine a regiment of Astra Militarum, raised from a feral world on the edge of the Segmentum Pacificus. They are fierce, loyal, and effective. Too effective. Their campaign into a warp-touched zone yields disturbing results. They adapt. They survive when others fall. They begin to fight with tactics learned from the enemy. Not heretical, merely different. The Minatorum grows suspicious. The commissariat takes notice. And when the war ends, they are not honored. They are recalled, disarmed, and dissolved. But some refuse to fade. Veterans gather in seclusion. They tell their stories. They pass down knowledge. Their children, indoctrinated not in the official creed, but in lived memory, begin to ask questions. And so, a second war is waged, not with lasguns, but with silence. The veterans vanish, their children disappear, the regimental records are overwritten, the planet is granted a new designation, the war is gone. But memory is stubborn. Across shrine worlds, pilgrims weep before statues whose inscriptions have been chiseled off. They cannot say why. On forged ships, scrap code pulses in forgotten data vaults, replaying grainy holos of units that do not exist. Astartes chaplains find cracked purity seals on relics they cannot trace. An inquisitor finds a journal, not heretical, merely inconvenient, and burns it in silence. Even within the hallowed halls of the Adeptus Astartes, the price is paid. Entire chapters, once lionized, now reduced to footnotes or suspiciously vague commendations. Some speak of the Dust Angels, a fleet-based chapter whose campaigns in the Maelstrom brought order where there was only madness. Their tactics were unorthodox, their victories total. Then a communication silence. No distress signal, no signs of corruption, just disappearance. Later, scattered remnants of their iconography appear, worn by Chaos warbands as trophies or perhaps as mockery. But no one speaks their name, no one claims vengeance, because officially, they never existed. Why does the Imperium choose this path? Because it is easier to bury a mistake than to learn from it, easier to silence than to explain. In a galaxy where truth is measured in bodies and loyalty in silence, to question the official record is to risk damnation. And so, the lies persist. But they are not perfect. On the battlefields of long-dead wars, sometimes the dirt shifts. Helmets are found beneath rubble, bearing markings unknown to any chapter. Data slates flicker back to life, revealing dispatches in formats no longer used. Servitors malfunction and speak in languages no one has taught them. And in the deep night of space, the Vox sometimes crackles. Not with enemy signals, but with pleas. Coordinates to sectors that do not exist. Calls for help from soldiers listed as KIA 3 centuries ago. The Imperium ignores them, files them under anomalous warp phenomena. But the truth refuses to die. Because memory is not just data. It is sacrifice. It is meaning. And every time the Imperium erases another crusade, it wounds itself. It teaches its own people that their loyalty is conditional, that their heroism can be undone with a quill stroke, that the Emperor's light shines only on the parts of the past deemed politically safe. But the stars remember. The dead remember. And somewhere in the silence between stars, those who were forgotten still march. Not for vengeance, but for remembrance. For the right to exist, even if only in whispered tales told by the dying to no one at all. And if you've made it this far, if the echoes of these lost wars stirred something in you, then honor them not with silence, but with voice. Subscribe to this channel. Share the stories they tried to erase. Because even in the grim darkness of the far future, memory is rebellion.